Herman Melville's Moby Dick, published in 1851, is one of the most profoundly epic works of American and world literature, partly an allegorical study of man versus religion and man versus nature and beast. Moby Dick is also a cetological nautical study of not only whales, but also man's place in nature, and it's almost an encyclopedic narrative, an encyclopedic celebration that is sort of split between sort of the religious philosophical narrative that takes place of the ever vengeful Captain Ahab's pursuit of Moby Dick, who allegedly, we're led to believe, took Ahab's leg. That's sort of where this whole quest begins, but also the narrator, Ishmael himself, has sort of this beautifully objective, almost biblical view of the world, or his narration is very biblical, if you will, in that there's sort of an orderliness to everything that occurs in Moby Dick, although some of the characters such as Captain Ahab and Queequeg and some of the other harpooners on the Pequod boat that they travel on they come from a lot of chaotic backgrounds. Also, many of them are pagans, the harpooners, obviously Queequeg. So we have this pursuit of, or this celebration of the push and pull between the pagan characters and the more Christian-oriented characters that have their faith in the Christian worldview. And even beyond just the exchange of the characters, the entire dialogue of Moby Dick itself centers around this push and pull of faith versus the pagan worldview, which comes up time and again in the universe of Moby Dick. And sort of in relation to the topic of pagan versus Christian worldview that occurs in Herman Melville's Moby Dick, also relates profoundly to this idea of rational versus irrational. And we have the character, the narration of Ishmael, that sort of serves as the universal rational viewpoint, or the rational aspect of the novel, along with the scientific cetological study of whales, by the way, is cetology, if I didn't mention that. That sort of scientific rational perspective, that rational celebration that comes up in the novel, is sort of in direct conflict with Captain Ahab's reckless, suicidal even, pursuit of Moby Dick and revenge. So we have the Barnes & Noble's classic edition of Moby Dick. It doesn't really matter which edition. Just make sure that you're not reading the abridged version. You want to make sure that you have the full version. This particular version runs at about 654 pages. That's the typical length of Moby Dick, like I said, depending on which edition you have. This is a beautiful Barnes & Noble's classic edition, which has the original endnotes of Herman Melville, as well as some more modern and historical things to sort of put the universe of Moby Dick into perspective. So we talked about the rational part of the novel, which is sort of structured around Ishmael's narration, and Ishmael's point of view or worldview is very objective. It's not very judgmental per se. We do have some sort of cultural and religious things that come up, and I do have to sort of discuss what we discussed briefly in our previous little synopsis of Moby Dick in the reading update a few weeks ago, is that Ishmael's relationship with the native harpooner Queequeg is rather homoerotic. Obviously the universe of Herman Melville is not complete without some speculation or some studies of what exactly his sexual preference was. Not that it particularly matters in the overall profundity, if you will, of Moby Dick, but it's definitely not something that I think readers or scholars should shy away from. I think there is a wonderful flirtation, if you will, of within the relationship of Ishmael and Queequeg, of a potentially suppressed or maybe not so suppressed homoerotic tendency of Herman Melville. Was Herman Melville possibly gay, bisexual? I think that's worth exploring that. Or it could just be more of sort of this, as the Greeks would call it, sort of this philosophical agape, or godly, heavenly love that transcends any physical or sensual pleasures. Maybe that's what he's exploring with his relationship with Queequeg, but it's hard to ignore, especially in the early scenes when they're getting ready to board the Pequod, which is the ship that's going to transport these characters through this wonderful labyrinth universe of man and beast and sort of this nautical escapism that's taking place within the universe of Moby Dick. If I'm saying nautical, that basically means related to the ocean, related to the sea. And when I say cetology or cetological, that's basically the study of whales. I'm probably going to be using those terms quite a bit. But there's many scenes where Queequeg and Ishmael are snuggling in bed, or Ishmael is observing Queequeg sleeping in a very admirable sort of sensual manner. So maybe it is almost like this Michelangelo-esque celebration of brotherly agape masculinity, which he did not intend to be gay or homosexual in nature at all, but I tend to believe that Herman Melville was exploring some aspects of his, sensual, sexual pleasures, if you will, towards maybe Queequeg, or he was sort of getting that off his chest. He was getting his own homoerotic desires. I haven't read a biography of Herman Melville, so I'm not sure exactly what his relationship status was, but you can definitely get the sense that there's a homoerotic element in Moby Dick, and I'm not trying to sound like postmodern politically driven or identity politics driven reviewer or scholar, but I think that's cool that Herman Melville put that in there. I'm not saying that that's the most important part of the novel, sort of like a modern scholar would, or that we should view Moby Dick in its entirety through a homoerotic worldview. No, I don't believe that's the case, but it's definitely worth mentioning, especially in the early chapters, and just this affinity that Herman Melville has, whether it was homoerotic or not. He has a beautiful relationship with Queequeg, which I think is absolutely wonderful and inspiring. And although Queequeg is this native pagan-esque heathen who carries around a little black wooden statue of a god, an idol, if you will, and Ishmael is sort of observing this wonderful character Queequeg, and he can't quite figure him out. But there's again that push and pull of the traditional English Western worldview of Ishmael that is maybe not so familiar with the pagan-esque philosophies, but the way that he sort of respectfully observes from afar. He doesn't necessarily try to impose his Christianity on the other characters. Ishmael does not really try to convince the pagan characters that they're doing something wrong. He sort of observed from a distance and just beautifully describes for us his impressions of these wild heathenistic characters. Now, some people have read that as sort of an ignorance on the part of Herman Melville, or that he's sort of fetishizing native cultures and sort of that thing. So that maybe could be one way to read it. Overall, we had the aspect of the homoerotic thing that's explored between Queequeg and Ishmael, but also this beautiful sort of philosophical exchange of the Christian worldview versus the wild world of paganism that comes up in time and time again in the world of Moby Dick. And also another beautiful way that Ishmael is sort of observing non-judgmentally from afar is the way that he interacts with Captain Ahab, or his lack of interactions rather, but the fact that he never really particularly judges Captain Ahab's vengeful, sort of almost borderline narcissistic evil pursuit of revenge for this sperm whale. Ishmael's narration, like I said, is both biblical in its sort of orderliness. It doesn't shy away from good and evil, but it doesn't necessarily impose a specific opinion or a specific morality on whether or not these characters are right or wrong. And I think that's also what's so beautifully fascinating, is that the pages of Moby Dick are very scriptural. Benjamin McVoy has talked about the fact that you can read Moby Dick as scripture. I absolutely agree with that. You can obviously there's many parallels to Shakespeare, and there's sort of a Miltonian, Homeric tribute that takes place in the pages and the worldview of Herman Melville, and just this sense of complete orderliness within the chaos of these narcissistically reckless, vengeful characters like Captain Ahab. But there's a sense of sort of religious and universal unity and profundity that takes place. And as we get further into the novel, we are exposed to Captain Ahab's narcissistic revenge, borderline suicidal complex, and there's sort of this hide and seek, if you will, that takes place that carry the pages of Moby Dick. And within every 4 or 5 chapters, we're always thinking, oh, is he going to show us the whale? Is Moby Dick going to show up? Are they going to capture the whale? Is the Pequod going to get sunk by Moby Dick? But Herman Melville really makes you stick it out for the long term. So we talked about in the beginning, we sort of announced that Moby Dick was this philosophical religious study of man versus beast. What does that exactly mean? Obviously, we have Captain Ahab and his pursuit of Moby Dick, but also we have all of the characters as a whole working for or working beside Captain Ahab, sort of in pursuit of Captain Ahab's vengeful worldview. We sort of get this idea through Captain Ahab's leadership. A lot of these other characters are sometimes led astray, but they hold their own as far as their personalities, as far as the various aspects of the different characters. Most of these characters kind of hold their own, but the narration and the worldview is kind of dictated by, what's the word I'm looking for, by default by Captain Ahab's leadership and his sort of, not mind control, but his sort of influence that he has on the rationale or the morale of these other characters to get behind the revenge of Moby Dick. We got to capture Moby Dick, and there is a prize for those that kill Moby Dick. I think they call it a doubloon or something. And by the end, Captain Ahab is not only sort of blinded by his quest, his thirst for revenge, but he's also blinded by his quest for the gold doubloons, and he ends up claiming the doubloons for himself. In terms of the philosophical religious perspective, or the philosophical spiritual conversation that's taking place within Moby Dick, the way that Herman Melville sort of lets the story unfold and the way that the characters' actions sort of speak for themselves, every single thing about Moby Dick sort of speaks for itself. Herman Melville is, although he is being instructive and sort of morally guiding and all those things, he's sort of letting you make your own decisions about man and religion and nature and the left-hand path versus Christianity. And there's really no page that I can remember where Herman Melville is necessarily preaching to us. I was not really getting that feeling that Herman Melville had sort of a doctrine that he was trying to get across. I think Herman Melville was more wrestling with his own insecurities of what is religion. Was Herman Melville sort of exploring his fascination, his curious fascination with the freedom that exists within the left-hand path or paganism, or was he sort of morally instructing us through the doors of God or Christianity? And I think that is sort of up to the reader, up to the scholar to sort of figure that out for themselves. But I did not really get the sense that Herman Melville was saying that Christianity good, paganism bad. I think there are so many more gray areas, especially with the way that he writes about his harpooner friend, Queequeg, and just how beautifully he describes sort of the mysterious freedom that Queequeg has, and in the fact that he's not sort of restricted by the Christian worldview. And in terms of the religious and philosophical pursuit, obviously Herman Melville's exploration takes place within the lens of, if you will, of the Christian worldview. Something else worth mentioning is the aspect of how Christianity comes into conflict with sort of the narrative of Moby Dick, the Gnostic element of Moby Dick. And we have sort of the Gnosticism of not only Ahab's pursuit of revenge, he's sort of seeking this salvation through revenge that's obviously not part of religion. He's seeking this sort of esoteric Gnostic fulfillment through his revenge, through his dogged pursuit of killing Moby Dick. And Ahab himself sort of becomes this Gnostic figure, sort of like you might see with Judge Holden from Blood Meridian, sort of this bloodlust that sort of overshadows and overpowers any other form of rationale, any type of religious rationale or sort of religious spiritual morality is clouded by this pursuit of violence and of bloodshed and of revenge. Something else in the realm of Gnosticism sort of is, like we said, not only Captain Ahab's pursuit of this creature, but also the way that Moby Dick functions as sort of the creature in Gnosticism known as the demiurge, which is actually an ancient Greek deity, an ancient Greek god, sort of manifested in beastly form of sort of like this serpent-esque half lion, half whale, half fish-like creature, sort of functioned as this creature that was distinct from a supreme being, and he did not have, the demiurge did not have the spiritual purity or the spiritual morality of the actual gods. He was sort of like an afterthought, if you will. And Moby Dick himself, as a creature, as through Captain Ahab's Gnostic pursuit of revenge and bloodshed of Moby Dick himself sort of becomes this demiurge, and the salvation is not only pursued by Captain Ahab to sort of reach spiritual salvation or satisfaction through his bloodlust and his revenge and his defiance of God and of also the universe, but also the way that Moby Dick is essentially, through the eyes of Ahab, is esoteric lesser god that functions quite well as a demiurge. And we can sort of see the battle between the worldview of Christianity that is a strong point in Herman Melville's worldview. We talked about the clash of cultures with Queequeg in Christianity and paganism, but we also have sort of Gnosticism on the one hand versus the right-hand path of Christianity on the other, and the way that it comes into conflict with these Gnostic endeavors, sort of these underlying Gnostic and esoteric, if you will, our favorite word on this channel, worldviews and esoteric narratives and pursuits that come up that also come in direct conflict with sort of the traditional Christian worldview. So within that push and pull, within that conversation of man versus beast, or I should say religion versus Gnosticism that it comes up with a lot of these characters. So we've discussed briefly the philosophical religious pursuit of man versus religion, man versus faith, faith versus more of the left-hand path, and we sort of stated that Herman Melville is not necessarily directing us to one point or the other, but we could definitely speculate that Herman Melville is almost sort of in this Dante-esque manner. He's sort of presenting this philosophy or this promise of salvation that exists much more profoundly within the confines of the Christian worldview. Yet we have characters like Queequeg, the native harpooner, who are just completely admirable and completely free and sort of exist in this no rules sort of way that they interact with the world of Moby Dick, where we almost get the sense that maybe Herman Melville is saying that he admires these pagan characters much more than he does the Christian ones, because they don't play by the rules per se. They sort of have this mystical confidence to them, if you will. And sort of going further beyond the religious topic of man versus religion or faith, we have the very strong endeavor of Moby Dick to present for us the conflict that comes when man confronts beast. And there's a quote from page 447 that says, "No folly of the beast which is not infinitely outdone by the madness of men." Or let me read that again. "No folly of the beast which is not infinitely outdone by the madness of men." So he's basically saying that he goes on this whole monologue about how many creatures, will do things that are self-destructive to them. Sometimes they'll run off cliffs, or they'll swim into a whale's mouth, for example, if we're talking about the sea, or they will, sort of let themselves be hunted for some odd reason. But there's really no stupidity or no clumsy recklessness that really compares to the folly and the selfishness of man, the stupidity of man, and how man and that's sort of a metaphor for what we were discussing earlier, how all of these characters are sort of blindly following Queequeg. Yes, they do have their own endeavors. They're trying to make money, they're trying to support their families, or trying to escape their families like Captain Ahab is. We learned that Captain Ahab, left his lady behind, left his wife behind for this crazy pursuit of Moby Dick. And just these wonderful ways that these characters are so fascinatingly conflicted. And towards the latter part of the novel, the reader might even start speculating that Moby Dick is more of sort of an idea, an archetype, a ghost even, because we've yet to see Moby Dick. I mean, even by the time you get to page 500, we haven't really seen Moby Dick. And it's almost like what they tell you in if you're writing a horror story, don't unveil the monster, let things be left unseen. And I think that's another aspect that's so fascinating about Herman Melville, that it would have been fascinating for Herman Melville to write a horror novel or a scary thriller, because he would have done that very well. And we get this idea that these characters, and particularly Captain Ahab himself, are trying to make us think that these whales are so bloodthirsty and they're so reckless and they're so evil and they sink ships, and yes, they do that, and Herman Melville explains to us in the more scientific passages that whales are very capable of stalking their prey and so on and so forth. But we get this idea that, like in the Beauty and the Beast, when Gaston was filling everybody's head with this ideas of a horrible, monstrous beast, or sort of like the Elephant Man, where they think the Elephant Man is evil. And by the time we get to the end of the novel, we sympathize with Moby Dick, because the pages of this novel explain and explore the suffering that sperm whales and white whales and all kinds of different whales undergo through the folly of man. So there's almost I don't want to say a vegetarian-esque animal rights motive to this book, but there's some brutal passages where they're cutting up the meat of the whale and feasting on it, and he talks about the blubber and all this fascinating stuff. So if this book doesn't make a vegetarian out of somebody, I would not be surprised. I'm not saying that was Herman Melville's intention, but we get the sense that despite how much these characters want us to dislike or want us to grapple with them on their vengeful pursuit of Moby Dick, by the end of the novel, we feel more for Moby Dick than we do any of these characters. Yes, there is a part of us that sort of wants Captain Ahab and Ishmael and Queequeg and the harpooners to capture Moby Dick. I think that's definitely, we're kind of rooting for these characters somewhat, but the other part of us is like, no, I really hope that Moby Dick comes up from these darkened oceans and just totally throws these characters for a loop and sinks their ship, and we sort of start to get frustrated with Captain Ahab's narcissistic stupidity. And I think that's what Herman Melville was getting at. And there almost is this series of events that occurs towards the end of the novel where Moby Dick is almost giving Captain Ahab several chances to stop pursuing him, several chances at life, if you will. But Captain Ahab continues in the face of death, in the face of suicide, continues to sort of narcissistically and foolishly pursue Moby Dick for this unquenchable sense of revenge that never we sort of start to realize this of revenge and this unquenchable bloodthirstiness that exists within Ahab can never be fulfilled, and that's what drives Captain Ahab to his ultimate destination. I don't want to give too many spoilers away, but I've mentioned suicide and narcissism, and so there is that aspect of how man, through man's own folly, whether that's revenge or greed or a dogged, foolish religious pursuit, sort of this crusading, marauding sense of morality, that he is more powerful than beast or more powerful than God or more powerful than nature, that in essence is man's ultimate demise. And that is what is ultimately explored within the pages of Moby Dick. So like I said, it is both a study of religious celebration, but also of religious conflict, of paganism versus Christianity, but also heathens versus Christian people, and also the sort of the exotic fetishization, if you will, but also the fear of the left-hand path, sort of that mystical world of Native American spirituality or pagan spirituality that exists in the curiosity of Ishmael, but also there's the pursuit of good and evil that we get with Moby Dick versus Ishmael, or Moby Dick versus Captain Ahab versus Ishmael. Ishmael is the more rational side of Herman Melville's universe, whereas Captain Ahab represents sort of this chaos, this revenge, this hatred, this narcissistic pursuit, a narcissistic supply, but also we have sort of the historical push and pull of what is more important. Is history more important? Is spirituality more important? Is morals and ethics and the coexistence with other animals and other people? That's also an important aspect of Moby Dick, and it's a beautiful celebration really of humanity as a whole. And obviously there's a lot of studies on YouTube about Moby Dick. You can read some biographies of Melville, but I do hope that this rather short analysis put into perspective the overall points of Moby Dick. There's a lot of things, different things that we probably glossed over or that we could dissect further, but we talked about sort of the religious manner, the scriptural tone that Moby Dick, the pages of Moby Dick have, versus sort of the more scientific, nautical, cetological / historical things that come up in Moby Dick. And there's sort of this push and pull between not only good, evil, religion, man, and beast, but also science, rationale, philosophy, and the wild, untamed terrain, if you will, of nature, which is ultimately, by the time we get to the ending pages of Moby Dick, we understand that Herman Melville almost worships nature almost like a pagan would, if you will. He sort of worships that all-consuming, all-powerful force of nature and beast that is so much more powerful than the folly of man. So thank you so much for watching our little analysis of Moby Dick here. We do have some great content coming up for you guys very soon. Leave your comments below about something about Moby Dick or Herman Melville that might help me to conceptualize the pages and the dialogues of Moby Dick. Like I said, Moby Dick is something that you'll read endlessly throughout your life. It's not like something you just read once, but obviously there's a lot of parallels with the Bible and philosophy and good and evil, a lot of these sort of surface level things. But if we delve into the characters, the character arcs, the character studies of each individual character, like Ishmael, for example, we sort of get the sense that he has this wanderlust, and we start to wonder, why is Ishmael even a part of these wild, chaotic people on this boat called the Pequod? Because he seems so much more morally focused and more innocent than most of these other characters. But he does share a quite interesting homoerotic relationship with Queequeg. Yeah, just a lot of fascinating stuff there to be unpacked. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Make sure you guys hit that like button. Please subscribe, and please visit the playlist for other literature-related content. Follow me on Instagram at Andrew Marlowe Artist Official, and we'll see everybody next time.